This is Corolla DeVille, and you're watching Inkwife TV. So, in my spare time, I enjoy aquascaping, and this is a little aquarium that's in my room. That funny little blob in front of the rock, that light green stuff, those are shrimp. And here is Miss Lily, our shop snake, hanging out with the big aquarium in the front room. Anyway, I'm just being silly, showing you some of the cool things to look at while you're in our shop. The tattoo I was working on for today is coloring some flowers. I began these flowers about 2.5 months ago. I did the outline and all the gray wash shading in the first session. And for the second session, we were going to put some color in the flowers. The client wanted all of the colors to be very muted tones. So there's no real bright colors in this tattoo. I began shading with a green called Dirty Money. I'm going over all of the areas that had been gray washed in the previous session with the dark green and fading it out into the lighter areas because I will be adding a lighter green to give the leaf more tone. I always feel that you need a minimum of 3 colors when you're shading something if you want it to have some definition. So my first color technically was the gray wash that I put in, and then the second color was the dark green, that Dirty Money. And now you can see I'm coming in with my third color. It's a light jade color, and the jade is not going to be solidly applied. It will feather out obviously over the dark green, but it will also feather out just a little bit to the edge. It's not going to go solidly up to the edge. There's just going to be a slight bit of a feather on that edge, so the skin tone will show through just a bit to add a slight hint of lightness on the edges. But other than that, this tattoo is going to be pretty solidly colored. After I'd finished the forearm, I moved on to the outside part of her forearm. I first worked on the inside of her forearm. Then I moved on to the outside of her forearm and basically just repeated the whole process again. As you can see, I've added all of the shades of green to that outer part of her forearm, and now we're moving on to the back. The only thing that I did different with this, I used the same dark green, the same Dirty Money for all of the shadows, for all of the darker green shades in the leaves. But when I finished up on the thistle leaves, I used a different shade of green, and you'll see that here in a few minutes. In case you're wondering, I'm working with a 15 curved mag, and I'm probably running my machine at about 5.2 volts. I like to run my machine very, very soft, because it allows you to go over the skin many times, and if you take your time and set your needle right, then the ink goes in incredibly well, but it stays closer to the surface of the skin, so you get less scabbing and a faster healing time and more vivid colors. And you know, as you've seen where I've got light colors, you can see blood coming up through, so I am definitely punching that ink into the skin, but I'm able to set my machine low, and so it's hitting very, very gently. Now I've moved on to the thistles a little bit, and she wanted them to be blue tones instead of purple, so I first applied a cobalt into the shadow areas of the flowers, and then went in with a sky blue for the medium tones, and then to finish it up, you see, it's gray. I just dropped some gray in with my sky blue, so it kind of blended in a little. I didn't want solid gray, just a little bit, but it finished those thistles up nicely. And she wanted the chrysanthemum to be pink, but again, very muted pinks. So instead of going to my normal pink selection, I went to my Eternal Portrait ink set and pulled some pink skin tone colors to use instead of the normal, you know, bubblegum pink or the really bright pinks. I went with more, of a blush type of color. Everywhere that I applied shadows, I went over with this medium blush toned pink. How you apply your shadows and your first darker shades of color can really determine the shape of what you're making. I always try to use the direction my needle is going and the direction the ink is being laid in. I always try to use that to contour the tattoo. Here I've got a lighter shade of pink, and I'm going in using that as a mid-tone. And then this just shows really fast going over the whole thing, because it's kind of boring to go over all of those petals over and over, and I know it's boring for you to watch it too, so we're trying to rush through. But for the final bit, I used a very pale peach flesh tone for the highlights in this chrysanthemum, and even though it is incredibly close in tone to her skin, it is different, and it sets the flower apart from the rest of her skin. Just that slight difference in the edge of the flowers and her skin tone, but at the same time it keeps the chrysanthemum having those very muted tones that she wanted. She wanted the poppies to be white, which, normally poppies are very red, but there are white poppies out there, so I thought, sure, let's go for it. I went over the shadows with an almond color, and I'm sorry, my head is getting in the way. I've got to be more aware of where my head is, apparently. But first I went over the shadows with an almond color, and it was almost exactly the same as her skin tone, but just a little different, and it softened the shadows and set up a good perforation from the skin. Then after that, I went in with some blues. Oh yeah, I used that same gray blue mix that I had used in the thistles. I used for the shadows of the white poppies. You can't just use white ink when you're doing a white flower, because the white won't stand out. You have to use some other colors to make the white stand out. And here we go. Now I am applying my white ink. I've turned my machine down at this point to about 4.8 volts. I want it to be hitting the skin as softly as possible, but laying that ink up on top of the other layers of ink that I have already put into the tattoo. You can see blood coming straight up through that ink. That's because the ink is a very light tone. I've had many clients come in, and when I begin to apply those lighter color inks on them, they look in bewilderment and say, I never saw it never bled like this before. And I said, well, it does because it's light ink. You just never saw it before. It was always there. But I love how this piece turned out. It's so very pretty and delicate and should really hold the color for a long time, and the whites stand out against the rest of her skin tone. I hope to see you again next week. Thanks for watching.